Good evening. I'm glad to be here with you, even if remotely. Thanks for the invitation to offer the Faculty of Theology's annual spring lecture at Jessup University. I'm grateful to Dr. Cynthia Schaefer-Elliott and everyone involved for their hospitality and kindness along the way. While sad I can't be with you in person, I'm happy for the technology and thankful for the assistance so I can join you remotely tonight. Thanks to Fairview United Church as well for their help in video recording this lecture in advance, and especially to Les and Deborah, who are here with me today making this possible. So in this talk, I'd like to invite us to think differently, to think imaginatively about the nature of belonging together, of being church, and consider disability not as abnormal or other, but as a different way of being embodied and vulnerably human together in God's grace. This means opening pathways beyond the dividing lines that we often mark out inside and outside, and draw lines between people that create barriers to participation and belonging. In this way, possibilities for being church may emerge that resonate with a hospitality deeper and wider than any human conventions or constructs, because it roots in the love of God and it becomes real in our love for one another. So, as you can see here, my talk's going to involve 4 steps. First, I'd like to tease our imagination a bit by discussing what it means to belong together as church. Along with many who write in disability theology, I highlight the term belonging rather than tolerance or inclusion, because these other terms often don't go far enough to foster and convey the deep participation and genuine sense of being at home that is desired by many. Second, I'd like to offer some thoughts to help retool our perceptions of disability and belonging. For the reality is that often people with disabilities do not belong in our communities. Churches have what I'll call a we problem. Quotes around we. That means disability is marginalized in various ways as something on the outside of how a community identifies itself, and the term we functions in that community. A process of normalizing occurs, which deems some bodies in and others out. Some bodies objects of care, passively receiving programs, and some of those bodies demeaned and trivialized in the process. But I hope we can ask together, what is disability and what is normal? And who exactly is we? Third, to help us move beyond the we problem, I'm going to appeal to the biblical traditions of hospitality, which offer robust resources for thinking otherwise. Hospitality is about welcome, but not just something welcome to others, but welcoming with others. I want to highlight the preposition with as an important piece of this, because bearing witness to God's hospitable love with one another opens into a kind of withness. In fact, we might even say witness is a kind of withness. Finally, and fourth, this opens up prospects for what I'd like to call an expansive relational imagination in being church together. Together, dismantling barriers of attitudes and architecture and cultivating a wide sense of access that isn't just a one-time achievement, but an ongoing process that is co-created by and for all in the community. Access is not an add-on or a single achievement, but is multidimensional and is at the heart of belonging together. So first, moving beyond tolerance and inclusion. I'll begin with a passage from Scripture here that you can see, 1 Corinthians 12, which paints an ideal vision of belonging. And it reads this: "For just as the body is one and has many members, and all the members of the body, though many, are one body, so it is with Christ. For in the Spirit we were all baptized into one body, Jews or Greek, slaves or free, and we were all made to drink of one Spirit. Indeed, the body does not consist of one member, but of many." Notice here, it's not one kind of body among members, but one body, a communion created in God's grace, in the Spirit, with no them or others outside, and no privileged us in the center, but all as members. This goes deeper than social constructs that divide, and it challenges. Many kinds of bodies, in all our differences, abilities and disabilities alike, already are a beautiful web of honored gifts, a deeper we, a deeper us, woven together in God's eyes. So in this sense, the church, the body of Christ, is that place where welcome, access, and accommodation should be central features of a life together, through which all members, as Paul says in 1 Corinthians, have the same care for one another. Ephesians 2 goes further and speaks of the church as a household or family of God, in which dividing walls based upon human ordinances are abolished. Paul notes in Romans 12 and 1 Corinthians 12 that gifts are received from all members of this body, some of whom may be assumed to be weaker, but who are in fact indispensable to the body. The church is a place where all might give and receive gifts. All belong. And what does this look like? Think of the word belonging. When you belong, you're valued, you're accounted for, you're seen, you're heard, valued as a contributor. And when you're absent, you're missed because you're desired. But we're up against strong countercurrents in our society, and sadly, our churches often reflect this. Turning our attention specifically to disability, you'll notice the statistics here that show disability in the U.S. affects as many as 1 in 4 adults. Disability impacts all of us. And yet, do our churches reflect this? Statistics also show that people with disabilities and their families are generally less likely to attend church and more often experience negative results when attending church. As a parent of a son diagnosed on the autism spectrum and living myself with depression, this is troubling. It marks a human tendency to discriminate and set apart and exclude that which doesn't belong, that which has trouble fitting in with what is familiar or expected or considered acceptable among a group. In fact, we learn to call normal what is taken for granted and expected in a set of circumstances, in terms of certain abilities or capacities to perform and contribute, and according to standards like in our society, standards of efficiency, productivity, speed, almost hyper-emphasized in our society. And on the other side, we learn to stigmatize those who don't quite fit such attributes. We stigmatize the unfamiliar and strange as deviant, labeling abnormal. Associated with unpredictability, the abnormal is disruptive and unsettling. It doesn't belong. It's unwelcome. The lives of people with disability and mental health challenges too often reflect this kind of story. And in my own experience as a parent advocating with my son, the harsh reality of not belonging has been a real kind of thing for me. For my son, his own uniqueness presents itself in ways that sometimes challenge, indeed disrupt, taken for granted conventions and ideals that commonly are held up as normal. It's made me rethink things, let alone the process of being a parent. For me, attending to him has meant letting go of preconceived expectations about what human flourishing may mean, about what being a good parent may mean, and instead paying attention, focusing, and doing so with deliberate and ongoing care to the ways his unique differences and cadences require an affirmation that doesn't fit with preconceived plans or expectation. It's made me rethink things, and the process has been disorienting and sometimes painful. But my son's particular way of being in the world is its own beauty, It shines outward and serves something other than satisfying the norms of a world set up in normal, neurotypical terms. It is its own good, precious in its own right. It's loved into being by a God whose image radiates in him, like a tabernacle summoning me to respond. And this has propelled me to think differently about what belonging means and what church means, along with rethinking what parenting means. So what does it really mean to belong? It goes much deeper than words, for often architectures communicate what belonging means despite our words. It goes beyond tolerances, which allows differences but may put up with them from a distance that doesn't really invite the transformation of the community but expects people to stay in place, to stay safe. It moves beyond inclusion, where an in-group brings in folks but doesn't rearrange the furniture, doesn't open itself to transformation by the presence of people, but instead assimilates into an already established and fixed space. It moves beyond even thin gestures of access, which may go part the way, but again, only in some senses open pathways to participation and not in a robust, ongoing way. So I'd like to suggest belonging is a verb, signaling being desired and at home. It entails a process of deep welcome and hospitality, which not only removes barriers to participation, but cultivates participation and the co-creation of life together, the effect of which transforms the whole community. For this to happen, however, retooling for a more expansive relation and imagination is needed, moving away from restrictive attitudes and practices, not just architecture, although that's a place to start, and towards new possibilities for being together. So secondly, let's move then to address the we problem as a way of thinking beyond normalcy. Put in a nutshell, this concerns how disability is perceived. Disability is not simply about them. People deemed other according to assumptions about what it means to be normal in a society focused on select values that highlight temporarily able-bodied people's so-called abilities. And I say temporary, as many do, because it's true that all people eventually grow old and die and become disabled. But paying attention to how the language works in communities is important, and it's often telling, because often language privileges some perspectives as inside and others outside, a we and a them, creating separation through framings, for example, that represent disability as a flaw, as a deficiency, something that requires a cure, or that reduces a person to their need for care, as if disability sums up a person, or that signals that a need is somehow a special thing about a person, which may miss other dimensions and actually trivialize a person. Language conveys attitudes that function to restrict rather than cultivate openness, and it's a failure of the imagination. As many writers in the field of disability studies suggest, the so-called problem of disability is not located in someone's body, but actually is symptomatic of a problem in the community or the society. We see this already in how I've highlighted language. But disability in this way signifies a relational term that opens attention to the ways an impairment that somebody has meets barriers to functioning and participation in a social setting. An impairment becomes a disability in an environment that restricts. Viewed in this way, the deeper problem is that society is disabling. Our faith communities are disabling. Our communities are constructed in ways that limit by creating barriers to participation and belonging. Architecture, but also attitudes and language and education and worship formats that show how the we is actually held captive to normalizing ideals which restrict participation and create only thin senses of belonging, normalizing ideals which are actually our idols in a culture that hyper-emphasizes perfection, beauty, productivity, independence, efficiency, speed. We can think of many other terms that get held up as ideals that actually relatively few of us meet up to, but then are used to measure and value some bodies as disabled. Disability then conjures common perceptions of flaw and brokenness in this way, even sin or lack of faith when communities are co-opted by these normalizing regimes, treated as problems to be solved and cured, or as requiring the passive reception of care or programs, all of which in a real way frame disability as something to be contained or fixed or remade before a person can belong. Classic examples, as I've already mentioned, are treating disability as a sign of sin, a curse, a test of faith, or the result of a lack of faith. The story of Jesus' healing of the blind man in John 9, however, pushes back against these kinds of interpretations. His disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents?" Representing customary views, that he was born blind. And Jesus says, neither this man nor his parents sinned. But this happened so that the works of God might be displayed into him, pushing back against normalizing assumptions of the day. The disciples here demonstrate how it is that communities can create the conditions by which some people bear the burden of being represented as a sign of deficiency, of flaw, or need, met with low expectations, or no expectations at all. So the point is that it's the social order that excludes and makes an impairment disabling by creating barriers. It might not be an exaggeration then in this frame of thinking to say that the appearance of disability in a social situation, say the sanctuary of a church, serves to expose the pretense to normalcy that preoccupies a community's members. That is, space and time and procedures together are set up in ways that expect certain kinds of bodies and not others. For example, as indicated by architecture or perhaps even a strict protocol in worship format that allows no room for various kinds of embodiments. This conveys a theology, even without speaking about it, these kinds of assumptions. So the reality is then when people with disabilities and their families show up in faith communities, the result is disruptive and disorienting for communities. Non-disabled people become uncomfortable, unsure what to do. Disability then becomes represented as something needing containment through programs and treatment, often done under the guise of care and inclusion. Many examples come to mind, but one might be keeping certain people out of worship for fear of disruption by starting a special needs class. Even the title is interesting, which one parent told me this kind of process at their church was more an effort to manage other people's discomforts with her daughter's occasional verbal outbursts than actually attending to her daughter. Or, another example, treating people with disabilities as special blessings or an inspiration for a community, which can actually say more about the community's need to remake disability into something palatable for them, an image for an us or we, rather than genuinely attending and coming alongside persons. Another example, one which I've encountered, is that depression is a sign of lack of faith. I can think of ways in my own journey that might be true, but I think that is a generalization that sums up an experience which is much more difficult and complex. There are many ways then here that normalcy distorts attitudes and perceptions. But what is normal? And what constitutes a disability? Who decides? These are important questions to ask if we're to be serious in our communities about reimagining what it means to be together, creating hospitable and open communities of belonging for all, created with and for and by people with disabilities and their families as well. So the key point I'm stressing here is that disability involves social processes and systems of normalcy that create obstacles that limit or restrict participation. By these, an impairment becomes deemed a problem. And that impairment then becomes a matter of them, those others. But actually, disability is not about them. Disability is about everyone, disabled and able-bodied alike, because ability and disability are part of the same system, participating in social processes and structures that marginalize by erecting barriers, whether in attitudes or architectures, or I'll say more, educational systems, or the way we speak our language and communicate. Disability punctures the illusion of normalcy. In fact, unsettling and disrupting business as usual in communities, exposing how lines are drawn. So the question is, are we paying attention to this and addressing it? The first task is to do that, is to pay attention and challenge and re-examine how our communities have been co-opted into restrictive imaginaries that build barriers between people and create inequity, even in churches. So, if instead of making disability an individual's problem that needs changing in order to fit into a community, we shift the focus to the community as a problem, disability becomes an opening towards change and transformation of the community. And change is required if belonging is to honor persons with disabilities not simply as passive recipients of care, but as contributors, not guests, but hosts, key partners in the making of life together. An example of this would be words from my son, who said once to me, "Let me do it, Dad, not your way, but mine." Perhaps like churches, my own pretense to knowing better and efforts to do for, in a unilateral kind of way, get in the way of genuinely attending and responding. In all, disability's provocation in a community might actually then be an invocation into a deeper sense of belonging. And in my understanding, this is God's call, summoning and challenging us to live more deeply into what it means to be a church. But to respond to such an invocation, communities need to expand their imagination and work to overcome aversion to disruption and surprise. And here, hospitality can be a resource. So I come to the third section, towards hospitality with. Doing the groundwork we've done so far helps us to begin to rethink what hospitality means. But there's a danger here, because hospitality as welcome can become loaded with baggage, wrongly presuming another's condition is strange or other in a negative sense I've described, somehow as deficient or undesirable or abnormal, so that the welcome is mainly about controlling. You can come inside, but don't ask for the furniture to be changed. There's no transformation allowed because hospitality then becomes unilateral, and postures that can amount to pity, that is, pretending from a distance to know what it would be like in somebody else's condition. Disability is often represented falsely this way. One, as if disability means that a person is a passive victim without any agency of their own. Or two, as if disability is only about one thing, missing the variety of experiences, both visible and invisible, that makes up disability experience. And three, as if disability sums up who a person is. I once heard disabled activist Judith Snow resist this kind of thinking by saying, "I have a good life. I am not a victim, so don't put me down into that place. Sure, life's hard sometimes, but I'm doing fine, and I have a lot to offer." This highlights the importance of reorienting notions of belonging at church, not as a doing for or ministry to, but rather as a being with. And being with depends upon welcoming as a gesture not of doing for, but coming alongside people and accompanying them in a variety of ways that are different than paternalistic or unilateral models. Of course, accommodations with medical and social assistance may be beneficial and significant, making participation in community possible. But accommodations like these are part of a larger momentum of being with and not ends in and of themselves. Exploring the notion of hospitality, then, can assist here, not as practice of etiquette or shallow invitations that are offered without supportive accommodations or true welcoming, but as a radical welcome, marked by an attentiveness that nourishes life together in mutual relationships of giving and receiving. The mutuality here is key, so let's explore it further. Biblical notions of hospitality are rooted in God's loving welcome, which invites similar care for others. The love of God and neighbor are joined. A basic underlying theological motif emerges in the Hebrew Scriptures, as God first welcomes, calling Israel out of Egypt and providing for them as sojourners in a strange land, so too they are called to welcome others. Indeed, the origin of the ability to welcome lies in having first received welcoming. As the adage goes, we learn to be good hosts by being good guests. And in biblical testimonies, the fact that God's hospitality takes priority of place has radical implications here. In receiving God's gift, the gift of sharing with and receiving others is made possible. Pushing further, we can see that God's extravagant hospitality opens up the possibility of deep relationships with others. The injunction to welcome the stranger, one who is unfamiliar, perhaps surprising with a visit from afar or embodying a different way of being, is not a way of managing a problem or normalizing an abnormality, but rather a way of loving neighbor. And in this, a work of transformation happens. In the dynamic exchange of hospitality, strangers become neighbors. That is, joined together in proximity and kindness. Hospitality, then, is a receptivity that makes room for others not merely to come inside, but to come alongside and to be with. All are considered neighbors in the making, and in fact, within the arch of God's love, already are neighbors from the very start. And as there is no one-size-fits-all kind of hospitality, this involves the risk of learning from others how to welcome, which requires an acknowledgement of vulnerability, of being unsure and being surprised. One can't prepare, one can't expect, because that is too rigid and stultifies the welcome. Offering hospitality, then, entails a disposition of humility and a generous willingness to receive from another, underscoring the fact that we're never autonomous and wholly complete in ourselves, but are vulnerable and limited and fragile earthen vessels who need to be made whole in relationships with others. For example, in my own journey as a parent, my son has taught me how to be with him, ushering me into a relationship I couldn't prepare for on my own terms. I have learned, and am still learning, how to be with him, how to be hospitable, though he would be quick to say I'm a work in progress. Hospitality makes space and time with others and nourishes relationships of mutual belonging. In hospitality, I learn how to receive another's way of welcoming, another's way of offering themselves to the relationship. So it's not so much a matter of hospitality to the stranger in one direction, as it is hospitality with or between strangers who have come into a relation as neighbors. There is mutuality and reciprocity at the core, which differs than paternalistic gestures of doing to or for others, where I assume to know better and the other simply receives. Hospitality inspires relations of companionship and being with, where both receives and gives. And in this exchange, something radical and paradoxical occurs. The guest becomes host, bestowing a blessing, and the alleged host becomes the guest, receiving a blessing. Paradoxically, the so-called stranger is now the one whose hospitality becomes central, on whom the host ends up, in a certain sense, depending. The unexpected arrival of the stranger becomes a vehicle of blessing, And we see this dynamic in the story of Abraham and Sarah, and how the welcoming of three strangers is an opening to the reception of divine blessing in Genesis. We see in the discovery of the risen Christ and the breaking of bread on the Emmaus Road in Luke 24. And we see it with Jesus' exhortation, whoever welcomes you welcomes me, and whoever welcomes me welcomes the one who sent me, in Matthew 10:40. Jesus identifies the redemptive work of God in him with hospitality. Elsewhere in Matthew 25:40, he identifies the weak and the destitute outsider, those in need, made vulnerable by society, and from whom society expects little, as the focus of his presence, such that by welcoming these, one welcomes him. This makes hospitality, in fact, a spiritual practice, and it disrupts the human tendency to secure itself by ability, strength, power, domination, wealth, status. Blessed are the meek and the vulnerable, the disinherited, for God is especially present to them. The Apostle Paul, in fact, frames a theology of weakness based on this in 1 Corinthians 1:26 through 31, acknowledging how God chooses the foolishness and the lowness to do great things, which disrupt wisdom and strength according to the world's sense of normalcy. Paul develops this further in 2 Corinthians, speaking at length of how alleged weakness becomes a vessel for the power of God to be revealed. It is in hospitality's preferential option for the stranger, the unexpected one, from whom society anticipates little and considers weak, that the gracious and transformative work of God becomes manifest. This radical reversal of biblical hospitality challenges society's way of valuing some abilities over others and excluding on this basis. Secondly, it shifts the imagination away from giving to and doing for, and instead, 3, highlights mutual giving and receiving as a deeply spiritual practice. In welcoming one another, there is encounter with the divine. We are tabernacles to one another, radiating the image of God, such that in receiving another, we receive something of God. In a real sense, the love of God and the love of neighbor are interwoven correlates. Bearing witness to God's hospitable love with one another is witness as witness. With this, I come to the fourth and final section here of the talk, cultivating an expansive relational imagination. The relational spirituality here in hospitality is powerful, and it can open up transformation in community by enlarging and enriching the relationships there, welcoming children and adults and their families with disabilities. Places capable of receiving unanticipated gifts. Going farther, we can see that at the heart of belonging is the fact that in the end, we receive our existence from one another in relationships of vulnerable interdependence. This turns upside down systems of exchange based on normalcy, which shun vulnerability and opens us to recognizing each other's vulnerability and particular bodies made vulnerable by society with caring attentiveness. It cultivates empathy and compassion and builds respect among peoples. In the end, genuine wholeness is realized not through ability, but through an acknowledgement of vulnerability that is made concrete in relations of mutual giving to and receiving from each other. Concretely, the vulnerability of another person, for example, my son in my own experience, is a preciousness that holds me to itself, that summons me to a response. In fact, that summons me to a response-ableness, so that wholeness might come through a life that grows together. In the end, full humanity is neither diminished by disability nor confirmed by ability. Instead, speaking theologically, it's a factor of the interdependent relationships we share with one another as vulnerable creatures loved into a being by a hospitable God that fashions us in the image of that God. There is a wider horizon in which all persons, in their uniqueness, their preciousness, and vulnerability, coexist. And this horizon is the unfolding presence of a gracious and hospitable God. This is why the moral openness of hospitality is central. An openness to receiving gifts from all, alongside and with persons with disabilities, is part of being a transformative community. Creating access, then, becomes an ongoing journey that is relational and not a one-time achievement if we take what's been said seriously or a box to check on the list. Access is a pathway to participation, a process creating space for all to co-create being together. And the creative energy emerging in this dynamic doesn't so much look like a strict linear process as it does a kind of artistry, fueled by an expansive relational imagination in which members, in their differences, different kinds of bodies with different kinds of gifts, ongoingly improvise and build resonance together. It's artistry, and this kind of artistry makes for a transformative kind of togetherness. What would our cultures and churches look like inside such a vision? For our churches, as part of the body of Christ, they might become vulnerable communions of belonging, grace-filled communities wherein many kinds of bodies contribute as members. The words of Paul from Romans 12:6 deeply resonate with me, so it's worth concluding with them. We have gifts that differ according to the grace given to us. Would we live into that? So in concluding, I'd like to highlight some pathways forward, as you can see in the text. I don't have time to develop all of them here with you today, but I'd like to run through them, and maybe in our conversation together we can talk more about steps to build pathways forward. First, churches might ask the big question: how can this community demonstrate more commitment for belonging for all, to belonging for all? What is its mission? What are its policies? Who are its leadership? And how these might align with a vision for witness as witness. Asking three questions, then, I've got here, secondly, but they build from the first. Questions like, who's there? Who's there? Who's expected? What are we saying about ourselves? And who's in the community? But then, who's not there? And why? I once visited a church that basically said, we don't have people with disabilities here, so the problem isn't an issue for us. That itself is quite telling. I'll say no more. Of who is not there, who's in the community that the church might serve. And finally, who's where? Who's where in the community? Do low expectations relegate some to the margins? And as Bell Hooks says, margins then can be sites of wisdom that actually might open up shifting of power and leadership. Who's in leadership? Are there fair representation that build equity in the community? Thirdly, education to retool the imagination, much along the lines of what I've said. Disability is relational, it's complex, and people with disabilities aren't simply passive recipients of care. There are hidden and there are visible disabilities, and often hidden disabilities are silenced in our communities. Education. Fourth, attentiveness, even developing a spirituality of attentiveness that asks how to be supportive. How can we come alongside and accompany and be more attentive? A fifth one comes from this, building ministry with, not to, involving people with disabilities in leadership, not simply developing programs for the basement during worship. 6, ministry focused not on deficits, but on possibilities. I think that of needs assessments here and how often disability is considered resource drain instead of appreciative inquiries, which look to possibilities. What distinct gifts might be made possible for enriching the belonging of who we are together, bringing out gifts rather than seeing simply resources to be drained. 7, to find ways of building shared affinity among the community. Shared affinity, where people identify with one another. Perhaps it's having a story-sharing circle. Perhaps it's in offering leadership by people with disabilities. Perhaps it's developing ways of sitting together, Bible studies, Building shared affinity is important so people can recognize and resonate with one another. 8, work for ongoing and multidimensional access. In this sense, as I mentioned, access, like belonging, is a process. It's a verb. It's an ongoing thing and not a destination or some specific achievement. And access is navigated by, for, and with all. Policy supports this. Perhaps thinking of the motif of artistry then, can think about how access might happen. How can we be creative together to build pathways to participation? And finally, to connect with the larger community for supports. There are agencies and resources in local communities that can support faith communities and solidarity and alignment with, so churches can be a work of justice in the social community, but also better support members who might need accommodations that the church resources can't have. We can talk a lot more about these, but I'll stop for here, thanking you again for inviting me, and I hope this talk has been helpful.